Here's the shot we'll be looking at. And now, while I think most of you know this image and where it comes from, I just feel like if I'm going to be using it in a tutorial, ethically speaking, I should credit gunshowcomic.com and the artist KC Green. To get started, like in any tutorial with Lockdown, you need to generate your vectors. So you apply Lockdown, use the connected vector mode, set it to extremely accurate, press full vector setup and render. This is covered in other tutorials. I've already rendered these vectors. First, I'll do the bare minimum on the shot, and I'm just going to place some tracking points. And let's see what happens. It should come as no surprise that all the areas that were well textured, like the bubbles and the cup, tracked pretty well. And this area in the liquid where reflections are changing and there's no real texture to latch on is a complete disaster. But this is liquid, so it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. So first, I would just get rid of all these points that are looking totally crazy. So I'll just alt-click and drag and get rid of them. So we filtered out the bad points, and most of these are okay. Before going too much further, let's just see how this looks. I'll auto-triangulate the mesh and press lockdown. Before I even play this back, I'm going to go into the stabilize comp and just try to loosely mask out where the liquid is. So I'm going to hide this checkerboard for a moment. I'll create a new solid, hide its visibility, and trace loosely around the coffee. I'll take this mask layer and set it to stencil alpha and turn the checkerboard back on. It's liquid, so it actually doesn't look too bad, even in the areas that aren't well defined. But let's go find any of these problematic areas and just delete the points. So we have a problem area down here. I can't quite tell what's happening, but I'll select this layer, render the points. And it just looks like this point is holding onto the cup a little bit too hard. The coffee would be moving around more. So I'm going to put in an intermediate point here. I'll just break these edges, holding Alt-Shift, clicking and dragging. And I'll hold down Control-Alt-Shift and click. And this will become an interpolated point that will kind of wiggle around between these points, and that should help a little bit. And then looking up at the top here, this is totally wrong and crazy. I think that this point is following the liquid and these points are more following the cup. But I don't think this one's necessary, so I'm going to get rid of it. Realistically, I think this will probably work. I'll get rid of this point up here, turn on interpolate partial tracks. I'll go back to my first frame, auto-triangulate, and I'll shut off render points and let's take a look again. It's almost there. I think I can just even out this mesh a little bit here. I'm going to break these connections and create a couple more extension points. I'll just clear the mesh and then auto-triangulate. And I'll press lockdown. And I think that's probably good enough. In my original project file, I actually decided not to pin to these edges and just let these flow loosely. And you'll notice this point and this point here I actually did track. I figured just tracking a couple of points out here on these little details, whatever this stuff is in the coffee, it was actually relatively easy to follow. It took a little bit of manual tracking. I'm just going to hide this for a moment so you can see. So for the texture I saw, this little ring kind of thing here, that actually stays in shape the whole way through the shot. You can see there. So I just tried to track that a couple of times. And then this point here was also pretty consistent through the whole shot. So that was easy enough to track. But I actually tracked that using the optional tracking filter. So that's just a feature in Lockdown that basically hides shading and just shows the high frequency details. And you'll see that that stuff is a lot easier to track when this filter is on. And I did that using the accurate mode, not using connected vectors. And if you wanted to get even more accurate, you could look for a point like this one here and follow that through the whole shot. But it's sloshing liquid. It's not really that important. It just has to follow the general motion. So I used pretty few points. So going back to the tutorial, I think I'm just going to use my original track just to make sure it's consistent. Now we can put in the comic image. I have it here in my project. And to do that, we'll go into this background stabilize comp and just drop this in. And I'll hide the checkerboard. And I believe the transfer mode I used was overlay. However, we really don't have to do that here in this stabilized comp because these two layers are guide layers, and this is just going to show up as the normal image regardless of what the transfer mode is. So we can just keep this on normal. And back in this main composition, this layer here, I'm just going to relabel this Lockdown Comic, and I'll label this one here Comic Texture. We'll set this to overlay. And you can see we're getting the general idea here. However, the edges are a little bit hard, so I'll show you how to correct that. Also, one of the things I did in my original shot is I made it so this image returned perfectly flat in center once we got to the end of the shot. And that was a little complicated, but we might as well put it in the tutorial. Also, there's a little bit of displacement on these bubbles. We'll get to that too. So the most important part is the smoothing, and this is a trick I haven't shown anyone, but I think it's time. And we actually do that with UV mapping. So what the heck is UV mapping? This is a name your own price plugin on aescripts.com called FT Pass. And you render out an image from a 3D program, which has a red to green ramp on it, red representing the left to right coordinates of the texture pass, green representing the up and down Y coordinates. And then this is going to let you apply a texture later on inside of After Effects. If you don't understand this concept, I would try to really understand this plugin before following along with the tutorial because it's pretty confusing. But basically, I'm going to make a fake nonsense UV map here. So I'll make a new solid, and I'll generate a gradient ramp, flipping it so green is at the top and black is at the bottom. And then I'm going to make another gradient ramp, where black is on the left and red is on the right. And between these two, you add them together, and this is creating a coordinate system where if we look at our red channel, the colors are representing pixel positions on red, left to right, and green, top to bottom. And these are added together into UV map. So I'm going to pre-compose these together and call this UV map, and this is working for a 1920 by 1080 frame. So what I want here is to run this UV map through lockdown and have it get distorted. So inside of here, we don't want this this is fine texture, this matting anymore. I'm just going to paste in this UV map here. And now this is going to run through lockdown. I'm going to also shut off this overlay. So you can see that this UV map is being swirled around with the coffee and moving with the motion. And this is going to let that plugin FT Pass track these colors. And you're thinking, why would we do such a crazy and pointless intermediate? Well, I'll show you. First, we need to get this comic back out into its own composition. So I'll grab this is fine comic here, and pull this back out. And if we look at this soloed, this is just a texture that fits to the 1920 by 1080 frame. So I'm going to pre-compose this, and I'll rename this. This should actually be named comic texture. And then this one here, we're just going to call this UV texture. And then this lockdown comic, we can just leave that the same. So this comic texture, we can actually hide this. So on this lockdown comic layer, this is how you apply the FT Pass plugin. Again, I would highly recommend checking out this tutorial and thoroughly understanding it before attempting this. And then we can apply this effect. For the texture, we have to choose the comic texture. And here where it says use original alpha, check that off. So now when we play this through, this is looking exactly like it did with Lockdown. Except of course this FTUV pass is acting as an intermediate. And you may be thinking, why would we do something so silly? Well, when this is acting as an intermediate here, all of these colors are actually in editable pixels. We can do things to this. And if we look at the contrast here, I'm just going to put on curves. You'll notice you can see some rigid edges here, and we can literally blur this out. So I'm going to go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Box Blur, and I'm just going to apply this and see how this is taking this image which has some sharp edges in it. I know it's a little hard to see, maybe it's easier to see over here. And I can actually just blur those out and it softens. This is essentially taking pixel coordinates and blurring them. So we don't want this contrast, that was just for example's sake. And I'm going to put this fast box blur below Lockdown, but above FTUV pass. And you'll notice, as I blend this effect on and on, again, these are just positions that have been converted to colors and now are being blurred and are being converted back to a texture. So I can use this blur and see how I'm able to soften all of these edges here. Let's blend this off, blend this on, off, on. And then crazy things happen when we get towards the edge of the frame. But basically, you just take this and just blend that just a little bit until things are nice and smooth. So now let me play that back. Here's the result. You can see it's pretty smooth. So now hopefully you've gotten some ideas of how do we return this back to the original shape and blend it. Well, this is going to be some crazy nonsense, so just be prepared for it. The trick to this is taking this UV pass here on this frame and making another one from the very end of the sequence with Lockdown. So let's just let's go through this piece by piece. So actually, I'll turn on FTUV pass, and what happened is we did our initial Lockdown on this first frame, so we're undistorted on this first frame. And now we'll go to our last frame, and I'll just take Lockdown and press Lockdown here. And now notice how we're undistorted here. This is all aligned and proper, and it distorts towards the beginning. So anyway, I'll just go back and undo that and hit Lockdown on this first frame. I'll hide FTVU pass to really drive home what's happening. So for this first layer, I'll call this Lockdown first frame, and I'll duplicate it, and I'll call it Lockdown last frame. So again, even though it's really difficult to see and understand what's happening here on this last frame, I'm going to move all the way over to the end. And then I'll press Lockdown saying that it should be undistorted on the last frame. So soloing this Lockdown last frame, what we have is we have it undistorted at the end and fully distorted at the beginning. And if we don't have this FTUV pass on, then it's just this red-green image of the UVs. And now if we take a look here on this Lockdown first frame, just toggling UV pass on, it's undistorted at the beginning, and it becomes distorted at the end. So we just have to mix these together. And how do we mix these together? It's actually really easy. We'll take the two of them, and we'll pre-compose them, and we'll just call this UVs. And inside of this composition, we can just do a blend. So actually, without doing a blend, I'm going to just toggle this on here halfway through to really drive the point home. So we're going from the UVs from this first frame pass here, and then about halfway through the shot, we just snap right over the UVs from the last frame. And in order to actually render this, we need FTUV pass on this composition, and we need rendering the comic texture. And let's play this. So starting undistorted, moving over, and then we cut over to the other UV pass, which was undistorted on the end, and it works its way out back to normal. So just really making sure you get that whole concept there. And inside this UV pass, well, really the answer is just to do a blend. So we'll say at the very beginning, we want this last frame to be at 0% opacity, blended completely off. And then on this last frame, we want it blended completely on. So you can see it starts undistorted, and then over time, it will work its way back to its original undistorted using the last frame projection. So this actually makes a perfect loop. Unfortunately, the footage doesn't. So again, we need to add a blur to this. So I'm going to go to Effect, Fast Box Blur, put it above the UV pass, set it to, I think we had around 8. Let's see this with the background on. And for the UVs, we'll set it to Overlay. And that distortion is looking pretty good. I think I probably should have expanded my mesh a little bit more. Whenever you get this weird pulling and tearing, that's because you've reached the end of the UV map and it's blurring with the black pixels that are in the main image. So I've gone a little bit too far here. And the way that you could fix that would just be by extending the mesh a little bit. One of the last finishing touches was putting on displacement on these bubbles. So I'm going to take this background layer and I'm going to duplicate it and put it up on top. And in order to displace based on the bubbles, the way that I do this is I just throw lockdown on very quickly and press the optional tracking filter. And see how this makes an image where it's not really showing shading, but just showing a little bit of the texture there of the bubbles. I'll set this down to maybe 2 pixels, and this will be our displacement image. Maybe even lessen the contrast a little bit. Yeah, it looks better. I'll call this displacement, and I'll hide this. And then on this layer, which has FTUV pass, we'll go to Effect, Distort, Displacement Map, and we're going to choose the displacement layer at the top, and make sure that we're using Effects and Masks, which is using that whole black and white thing. We'll use Luminance for our displacement. And we'll try maybe 2 pixels on each. Actually, let's just look at the vertical first and see which direction looks better. I think pushing it up a little bit looks better. And another thing we can do to soften out this displacement, because it's really extremely harsh, is on this displacement map, I'll just put on a fast blur and set it to like 2 pixels or something. Okay, so I'll hide this and we'll just see how that does if we try this on and off. I think that helps a lot. Maybe we'll try 1 pixel, 1.5. Here's the result. And of course, now we just have to do masking to get rid of these weird edges. I actually did this using lockdown, so I'm going to duplicate these 2 bottom layers, the background and the vectors. I'll put lockdown on here, connected vectors. And I'll just pick some points that will probably track well. So again, I'll turn on this optional tracking filter. This has 0 effect on the connected vectors, but usually if you see a good contrasty point using the optional tracking filter, then the vectors most likely picked up on it and tracked that point well. So that's the only reason I'm using this to pick points. So I know this is pretty high contrast that will probably track. And I'm trying to stay away from the liquid. And I can hide this tracking filter here and track right. These points look good enough to do some roto. I'll create some extension points around here. This is just to have some additional room to work with. I'll turn on Interpolate Partial Tracks and Auto Triangulate and press Lockdown. So you can see this checkerboard is following the cup pretty well, but let's go inside of this masking comp and we'll hide the checkerboard. And I'll make this stabilized layer not a guide layer because we actually want to use it. Actually, we'll just delete the checkerboard so it doesn't get in the way. And I'll create a new solid to act as a mask. So this mask will include most of this mug here. And then I'm just going to keyframe it just in case there's the slightest amount of drift. There's really not too much. That's the thing about rotoscoping inside of a stabilized comp is it's stabilized. So that should be pretty good. I'll check some other areas. That looks like that's mostly on. So let's turn on this mask and set it to stencil alpha. So it's showing just the cup. And maybe we'll feather it about 4 pixels or 5 pixels. It looks a little out of focus. Actually, I'll just put this inside the boundaries. And when we pressed lockdown, it created this background layer, which is just the original layer. That's completely unnecessary, so I'll delete that. Because I feather this at 5 pixels, sometimes I find that you should make the expansion half of that, so I'll set this to 2.5 pixels. And that will prevent the edge from being overrun too much. And let's play it. And you can see this edge here has been rotoed. Up here at the top, there's still a little bit of nonsense from that FTUV pass, but this doesn't take a genius to fix. On the UV layer, we can just make a mask. And I don't think we'll even need to keyframe it. That looks okay. And those are pretty much all the steps. And one more time, let's look at the final. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.